A brand new trailer means a ton of new information to sink our teeth into. So today we'll be taking a deep dive into the trailer itself, as well as going over a lot of the information that was shared with the press at the Summer Games Fest that maybe isn't highlighted or shown in the trailer as much. We start out on mission Grid 086 Infiltration, and this area has been taken over by arms dealers called RAD, so you can see their logo off on the right there. And those are the enemies that will primarily be fighting and that will be counterattacking our infiltration. And this area, along with many others throughout the game, I imagine, also have what they're calling dosers. And so that's going to be people that have become coral addicts. And so it's sort of like a drug. And so while they haven't gone into the specifics of it just yet, I imagine these dosers are going to play a big role in the storyline and probably even tie into your augmented human pilot, as you presumably use coral to be able to pilot your AC to this degree. One of the previous trailers also opens with establishing cerebral coral connection. And so there's potential implications for your handler or for other people controlling you through coral as well, especially if it's more of this addiction kind of drug situation. And so one thing to say early on is that these maps are absolutely massive. They've been described as if you took a map from something like 4 Answer or 3, and then a map from 5, and stuck them together. These are still way larger than even those combined. And so along with that, you'll get the ability to take different paths. So you can see a bridge off in the distance when we start this mission. You can see some pathways going lower, and so you could take any of those. You don't even necessarily have to take the course that this AC does. Along with that, I'm sure we'll get tons of opportunity for exploration, fingers crossed on the ability to find hidden parts. But they have confirmed that it isn't just the main boss, so you'll get mini bosses along the way, and I imagine that that'll depend on what route you take as well. So I think even just in that alone, there's a ton of replay value in going back through these missions and really combing through the level, finding all of the mini bosses, potentially finding the parts, things like that. But moving on from that, we'll get into a little bit of the movement and the mechanics of the game. Starting out with the boosters and movement, it is closer to Gen 3, Gen 4 in that we have more vertical movement this time. We don't have to kick off the walls like in Verdict today, so you can just fly vertically if you want to. Though it does seem like there's substantial drain on the generator, so if you could do anything like achieving infinite flight or getting incredibly high in the map is hard to say at this point, but it's not looking likely. We do get a look at Assault Boost a few times in there, and you can see it's not unidirectional like a quick boost, and it's obviously faster and more draining than your regular boost. But it looks to be very important for both combat as well as just navigating the maps. Here we get our first look at the HUD of the game, and while it wasn't explicitly shown in the gameplay trailer, they did show it to press at the event. I want to thank VatiVidya for both the rough mock-up of the HUD as well as for allowing other content creators to discuss his mock-up in their videos. So to me, this one is a lot more clean than in 5, which I'm happy with. It goes back to something closer to 4 Answer, and that generation. So on the left, we have mission objectives, as well as just our general speed. On the right, an altitude meter. Moving to the bottom left, we have our AP, an optional part slot, and that seems to be taking the place of the shoulder slots from previous games, which we'll get into as the garage is shown. You also have details of how many repair kits you have left, as well as the cooldown on your scan. In the bottom center area of the HUD, on top we have a stagger meter that'll gradually fill as you're hit until you're staggered. Below that, you have an energy gauge, which of course determines your ability to boost, use energy weapons, and any other mechanics that the game might have that include energy. Below that, you have a compass, with little dots highlighting where enemies are around you. And I really like the inclusion of a compass. It really helps, especially in these really large maps where there's tons of enemies. It helps in finding maybe those enemies you're missing, or in multiplayer, it'll help to determine where that other AC is, especially if the maps have a lot of detail and nooks and crannies to them. I think it'll keep multiplayer fights moving along at a reasonable pace if you just have a general direction of where the enemy might be. Moving to the right, we'll have ammo capacity for all of your weapons, both your left and right arm, as well as your left and right back weapons. Above that, we'll show how much money you're earning as you take down certain enemies, as well as probably some other information. Then, of course, we move on to the lock-on reticle, which just might be the most divisive thing in the Armored Core community right now. Historically, you've always had to turn your AC and keep enemies in a lockbox, and in this one it's confirmed we have both a soft and a hard lock system. So your soft lock is going to be as you approach these enemies here, you'll see your targeting reticle jump over to them, and you can still freely turn your AC and look away and do whatever, and your targeting reticle will kind of follow along with it, jumping onto enemies that are roughly in front of you or that you're looking at. But there's also a hard lock system, and that's entirely new to the series. So with the hard lock, you'll specifically select an enemy to lock onto, and then your camera will stay centered on them and pan around them as you move. So no longer will a large part of the gameplay be keeping enemies in your lock-on box. And that definitely has the community really divided. That's always been a big part of your skill level in Armored Core, is being able to maneuver and keep your enemies, especially in multiplayer, keep your enemies in that lock-on reticle. And it was a big part of especially lightweight gameplay, was to get out of that box and to prevent your enemies from being able to target you. And so there's definitely some concern, I would say, in the community over if this is going to lower the skill ceiling of the game, if it's going to make lightweights pointless to play since you can't necessarily get out of your enemy's lock. Though we don't know the specific details yet, it could be distance-based, it could be based in how your FCS operates. There might be something like long-range FCS, and then when you get close, that hard lock is no longer an option, or vice versa for your ACs with really short-range weaponry and melee attacks. We don't know the specifics just yet, but we do know that there's a hard lock-on. I'm of the personal opinion that the lock-on system did need a little bit of a refresh, and while it's yet to be determined until we can really get our hands on the game if the hard lock is a good thing or a bad thing, it's something that I'm personally excited about. I think it's going to simplify the lock-on game, but it's going to move that difficulty into other aspects of it, such as predicting your enemy, actually dodging them, getting in for some of the melee combos that we see later. I don't think it's necessarily going to lower the skill ceiling. I think it's just going to shift it some. So moving back to the HUD, you have your target reticle, which will start to jump to enemies. On the bottom corners of that, you have these little sliders that'll represent your ammo and probably your reload times for your weapons on the left and right side, respectively. Above that, you'll have a stagger meter for the enemies that you're locked onto. And so much like the one on the bottom of your HUD, that top one will gradually fill until the enemies are staggered. Right over the enemies, you'll see some damage numbers pop up as you hit them, so you can really tell what sort of damage numbers you're doing. Probably not super important for the little enemies, but I imagine it'll definitely be important for the large boss enemies. And while we don't fully know what sort of damage types we'll get in this game, we can be guaranteed at least kinetic or physical and energy weapons, and so it'll be important to know if you can't scan and determine the weakness of the boss, it'll be important to determine where their weak points are and what sort of damage you're doing to them so you can adjust accordingly. You'll also see all these little yellow bars with ones on them. That's going to be your missile lock-on, and so when you're in that soft lock-on mode, you can multi-lock your missiles, assuming that the missiles and the FCS you're using allow you to do that. And then as you shift into the hard lock-on, all of your missiles are going to be directed to that one specific target that you're locked onto. And it's important to say, too, that even though you are hard locked onto a single enemy, that you can shift that designated target as well. So you don't have to necessarily, get out of hard lock and back into it, but you can kind of bounce it around within the enemies that are on your screen. Moving on from that, you'll again see the assault boost, and there's a little charge up time to it, and then he'll dash in and blade that enemy. And the melee attacks in this one are just so smooth, especially compared to some of the older AC games where it could be kind of clunky. They do go on to use the Jumppad from there, so much like we had speculated before, the jump pads are used as a means to get around the map and reach higher elevations. You also don't see it in the trailer, but at the beginning of your mission, you're sort of launched into it on a jump pad as well, so maybe something related there. Here you get to see that stagger mechanic in use on smaller enemies. So once they're staggered, you can move in for this kick that will knock them backwards, so similar to the kick in AC5, a little more oomph to it. I imagine the distance you can knock them back is probably dependent on how heavy they are too, so your tanks will probably be barely nudged while your lightweights and small enemies will probably just go flying. But I think that combined with the new melee systems, the hard lock-on, as well as some other stuff we'll get into, I think it'll make for some really interesting gameplay. And this is part of that kind of combo system that they talk about, really getting in and making your playstyle your own and incorporating things maybe with low damage but high stun, just so you can stagger them and then kick them, go in for some melee attacks. The stagger system itself works very similar to Sekiro's, so sort of what we've been speculating. And in addition to being knocked back a little bit, it also does do extra damage. And while they haven't gone into detail about that, I'm curious if it's similar to having your primal armor knocked off in something like Armored Core 4, and so it drops a lot of your defense. We don't know just yet, but it will do extra damage when they're staggered. Or you will take extra damage when you get staggered. Moving on from there, we make our way through this gate, and it's not shown in the trailer, but that gate takes about 10 seconds or so to hack through, and so you're pretty vulnerable during that time. I imagine that the speed of that hacking will be controlled most likely by your head. Of course, none of that's confirmed just yet, but it takes about 10 seconds to get through, and I believe you're ambushed in that time as well. They also gave a look at the checkpoints, which you don't see in this trailer. Presumably there's one right before that gate, but they appear as these kind of white, opaque boxes that you move into, and that's going to be your checkpoints. So also in this clip, we get another good look at the ability to take different paths. So he chooses this upper one. There's still some potential options off to the right and left. We also just get a look at the size and scale of the maps here. So we went from that huge outdoor area, we're inside now, and it's definitely tight, and that's been a thing previously in the series too, and so you'd have these pretty tight corridors, and you'd have to plan accordingly because you can't necessarily evade. Sometimes missiles don't work great in these situations, especially if they're vertical missiles. But I do like that even though we're getting some indoor areas, we're getting some with some real height to them and some real dimension to them instead of just a long hallway to stand into. They're much more interesting than they have been in previous iterations of the series. And so after we take out that enemy and we move into this little corridor here, you get a good look again at assault boost. Moving in, that opens up and we get to immediately dash backwards. So take a good look at the shield here. You can see it automatically deploys from your left shoulder as soon as you're being attacked. But the interesting thing to note is this sort of sudden burst of energy right after it's deployed. And we had talked a little bit about that in the podcast as well. But they've confirmed that there's this brief moment of time, maybe a second or less, right after the shield's deployed where your defense is much higher. And so while we don't know exactly how these shields are activated, if it's a held button or anything like that, we do know that timing to block attacks, especially really large attacks, is going to be super important on it. And so from there, we'll get a good look at our first melee combo attack. So for this one, it's just this big double slash. and it's of course way more intricate than we've had in previous iterations of the series, and that's something they've confirmed too, is they're paying a lot more attention to melee combat in this one. We'll have a lot more interesting weapons, as well as what promises to be some pretty damaging combos for those weapons. Another interesting thing to note here is that they have confirmed charged melee attacks. So I imagine you'll have your quick kind of combos and then you'll have a big charge attack you can do. I would love to see melee weapons that almost have nothing but a really large charge attack. And so something that could almost one-shot an AC, but that you have to put a lot of effort into. And we will get to see at least one of the charged attacks later on in the trailer here. From there, we'll move up this vertical shaft and we'll get our first look at scanning. And so unlike in AC5, where you had to switch between a combat and a scan mode, in 6 it's sort of this pulse wave that comes out of you. And I imagine that the range that reaches is probably also determined by your head or potentially your FCS, most likely your head. And there's also a cooldown on it, and so on the HUD earlier we saw that little bar off to your left, and so that is going to show you the cooldown on your scan, and it's fairly reasonable. It seems to be right around 10 seconds or so in the demo. And after you scan, you can see those enemies through walls. You can actually lock onto them through walls as well, which of course lets you pre-plan before going out there. But it also lets you do things like fire missiles around corners at the enemies you're locked onto, and so I think that there's a lot to be said for the potential tactics of your scan, and depending on what sort of weapons we get, there could be some really interesting things that you could do there. We don't really know yet how much information you get from it. Do you get their armor points, weaknesses, things like that? I kind of expect that they'll dial it back a little bit from AC5. It seems like they've really tried to simplify things to a certain extent, at least on the HUD, really clean things up, which I think is a good thing. 5 had a lot of kind of visual information, as well as was just kind of visually messy and grainy in general. So I really love the clean look of this one. And so take a look at your missile behavior in this one. So there you see all of the missiles fire forward at that one enemy that you're hard locked onto. After he's destroyed, we'll shift over to the left here where there'll be 2 enemies that you're soft locked onto. And you'll see him kind of get both within his targeting reticle, fire his missiles, and the missiles will split evenly between the 2 targets. And so there they go, you can see them fly out and then split evenly 2 and 2 before he turns to acquire his next target. From there we get a good look at how easy it is to stay just horizontal even in the air, followed up by a quick kick attack after staggering that enemy. Here we're going to get a good look at where I'm sure that I'll spend all of my time, which is the garage. One thing that's a little unclear is if this is the main garage of the game or if it's just what the mid-mission garage looks like. So during this mission, he does end up dying to one of the enemy ACs that he fights. And so just right there, he switches out his AC to something a little bit more lightweight and more mobile. And so it's right at that checkpoint, right before this enemy. You just get to enter your garage, change things how you want, pick a different AC, whatever you want to do there, and jump right back into the mission where you were before. And there is a whole lot to unpack in the garage, so I think I'll probably do a separate video breakdown of it. But suffice it to say that even though I'm sure there's a ton of part options and a ton of customization, it has been streamlined a little bit, and there's a few things that are missing from the garage, and then a few things that are combined together. And of course, we haven't seen a massive amount of garage gameplay, so it's hard to really say at this point what all's missing, but we can definitely speculate. And so from there, we'll move back into fighting this AC. You'll see a lot of quick rapid-fire attacks from that right rifle or pistol, whatever it is you want to call it. You also get a good look at how quick you can turn, especially with that hard lock-on. Quick turn has been confirmed, and it's sounding like even though you have a hard lock on and you see him flip around really quick right there, it's sounding like the quick turn is going to be manual. And that'll be interesting. It raises the questions of if you can stay locked on to somebody who's behind you, or if your AC will automatically turn to face them. Turning speed's always been another huge piece of AC along with that lock-on, and so it's definitely another divisive point in the community. We've had quick turn previously, so honestly if they just smooth it out and make it where you quick turn automatically, it doesn't really hurt my feelings. And even manual is fine. You can see it's very smooth here. I'll be curious if it takes any amount of energy to do. I doubt it. I think the focus is on just fluidity and ease of movement in this one. So take a peek at that right-hand weapon. It goes from rapid firing to charging it up. And you'll see him kick and then shoot that charged pistol, which again knocks back that enemy. It's hard to say whether that fully staggers him again, if there's kind of a reset on that stagger. Maybe if you hit them hard enough while they're staggered, you can do it again, so kind of stagger lock them. Of course, they'd have to make sure that's balanced out for PvP especially, and that you can't just kind of cheese enemies with it. But it's an interesting look at those weapons that you can both rapid fire and or charge, much like your melee attacks. And while I don't think it's going to be every weapon, it'll be interesting to see the ones that you can do it with, and I imagine there's probably some really big attacks you can do as well. From there we get into the dagger combo, so you can see a bunch of rapid fire hits, and then this charged attack right there. And that's a description we get from the garage as well, that this dagger allows for a sweeping charged attack. And from that clip we move on to one more gate. Another checkpoint, I imagine, right before what is presumably the final boss of this level. And so this thing here is known as the Smart Sweeper. And take another good look at the beginning of this, and so you walk in, and this thing immediately has a very telegraphed attack where it'll light up, raise its big grinders, and dash forward with its arms out. And so they jump up to avoid that. And that is one thing I would say that's maybe a little bit more Souls-like, right, is those huge telegraphed attacks. And I hesitate even to really say that it's Souls-like, and that a lot of games have that, but it's very From Software in their recent years, right? And while AC has had big enemies in the past, very rarely have they had these big, obvious telegraphed attacks. And this guy does a lot of damage too, so we do get hit and it'll drop us into pretty much critical health on just that one hit. Of course you have to avoid all these little lava fireballs as well. And so there promises to be a lot of trial and error when fighting these bosses. A lot of dying, going back to the garage, and then reloading in front of them to try something different. At least if Evil Wally is anything to go off of. Though, along with the checkpoints, we do have repair kits, which seem to be fairly instantaneous, and so you use them, your AC will light up for a couple of seconds, and it'll restore most, if not all, of your armor points. So a lot of people have compared them to the flasks from Elden Ring. This is definitely one I'm a little bit torn on. I don't love the idea of an instant repair. It's always been part of the strategy previously to go in and have, carry more ammo on you, or have something with a little bit more armor points to change up how you had to complete the mission. But at the same time, missions have also been historically fairly short, and so this one does promise to have a lot longer individual missions, and so I think it's nice in that regard to have that ability to refresh your armor points. It also sounds like there'll be certain points that you can refresh those repair kits as well as refresh your armor points, get some ammo back, things like that. Though how common they are, how often you'll see those throughout the mission, we don't really know yet. But we are going to call it at that for today. There's obviously a ton of more info that we could go through. I plan to go through some of the clips individually, especially things like the garage, and really break down some of the potential implications and some things that we notice. And there'll be some additional info as well in the upcoming podcast as more and more people talk about their experiences at Summer Games Fest and some of the things that they noticed, some of the things that were covered. So a whole lot more to come, so stay tuned, and I'll see you next time.